Well, here we are. Federal election needs to be held before May, or by May 2025. Everybody's getting to the starting line. So what I want to look at today is corporate Australia's 2025 federal election war chest. Now, a lot of people are unhappy with the direction the Albanese-led Labor government has taken over the past 3 years. Yeah, but life, as you know, is about comparisons. And when you compare what they have done to what the coalition would like to do, well, then you've got a real issue. But you see, although the Albanese-led federal Labor government has been cozying up to business, the fact is that business, especially corporate Australia, is very, very, very unhappy with them. Look, they don't care about the Palestinian question. They don't care about social equality. What they care about is the profits they're able to make for their major shareholders and their primary office bearers. That's what they care about. Because, see, the races they run is different to the races a government runs. Their race is based on the principle of making ever-increasing profits for their major shareholders, irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs. While a government that isn't totally beholden to them, like the federal coalition, has a responsibility to put a brake on the corporate sector and provide some protection for the majority of people in this country. That doesn't mean that they have extraordinary powers, because you've got to understand that ultimately in a capitalist society, that's a private investment for private profit society, that ultimate political authority doesn't lie in Parliament. It lies in the boardrooms of national and transnational corporations, especially in this country, which is one of the most corporatised sovereign nation states on planet Earth, where we have, let's say, 100 corporations which dominate almost every aspect of our existence, from food to finances. So, why is corporate Australia so unhappy with the federal Labor government? Why has corporate Australia thrown down the gauntlet? Because as far as corporate Australia is concerned, the legislative agenda which the federal Labor government has pursued has eaten into their profits. Because you've got to understand, it's a threesome. Capitalist economics is a threesome. There's those who provide the capital, that's corporate Australia. There are those whose labour is required to make that capital create a profit, and as a customer. Now, quietly over the last 3 years, the federal Labor government has passed a number of legislative initiatives that have encroached on the profitability or the potential profitability of corporate Australia. And those legislative attempts have been based on actually trying to create a situation where there is the greatest good for the greatest number. We saw this in the increase, quite dramatic increase of wages for childcare workers and aged care workers. We've seen it through the federal government's support for wage increases to keep keep pace with inflation. We've seen it with the extension of Medicare in terms of it being a universal healthcare system. That's a pre-hospital admission. We have seen it in legislation which saw the brakes which are applied to the CFMEU removed by the abolition of the authority which had so much power that CFMEU members had less legal rights than somebody who imported $1 billion worth of cocaine or meth into this country. We've seen it especially in terms of the same work, same pay legislation. Now this legislation is at the centre of the difficulties that corporate Australia is having in terms of maintaining and expanding its profits. Because before this legislation was put into place, a classical example which you can understand is what happened with Qantas when Joyce was the CEO of Qantas, where thousands of workers were removed and they were replaced with contract workers who were hired from labour hire firms which paid them less. And this is a business model that had been used during the Morrison, Rudd, Abbott governments, coalition governments. So what it meant is that any decision made by the Fair Work Commission could be easily undermined by a corporation outsourcing its responsibility to its workers to a labour hire company which brought them in as contractors. So the same work for same pay legislation totally destroyed this business model. And in an era where interest rates have increased dramatically, where spending power has decreased, what we've seen is these large corporations have difficulty continuing to exploit customers while their workers are legally protected by legislation. So this is the crux of the matter. Legislation that's been put in place to protect workers' entitlements. We've also seen an expansion of workers' entitlements in this country. An expansion in terms of the days that people can take off, whether they have sick relatives, whether they're victims of domestic violence, whether they have psychological issues. And we've also seen an increase in claims through the courts using current legislation in terms of people who've been unfairly dismissed or harassed or bullied at work. So there's been this legislation, this wave of legislation over the last 2.5 years which has disturbed corporate Australia. So irrespective of the federal Labor government cozying up to the coal industry, cozying up to the Zionist lobby, cozying up to a variety, watering down environmental legislation to keep business on side. The fact is that as far as profitability is concerned, business is concerned, when you hear senior business leaders talking about the Albanese-led Labor government betraying the Hawke-Keating agreement from almost 40 years ago, which basically destroyed the ability of workers to collectively bargain, you begin to understand the situation. Now obviously, industrial relations policy should be, or workplace policy should be, a major issue at the next federal election. because the policies which have been promoted by the government in waiting, that's the Dutton-led coalition, are policies which will destroy all these gains. Now obviously, the accusations or allegations which were made against the construction arm of the CFMEU has spooked the Albanese-led government, and it's put in a legislative framework to place them in administration. Now the issue of the administration of the construction branch of the CFMEU is not just an issue of wages and conditions, it's an issue regarding the billions of dollars in superannuation funds which are now controlled not by the board of CBUS but by the administrator, and this is a huge issue that people are not looking at. But getting back to the CFMEU, obviously the government was spooked and put in an administrator. They did have the option, and we've seen it before with Labor governments, they did have the option of deregistering the construction branch of the CFMEU, which is an option which the Dutton-led Labor government would like to do. So although only 12% of workers are now in trade unions, some unions, especially the Construction, Forestry, Mining and Energy, Construction, Forestry, Maritime and Energy Union, some unions are a potential threat to the corporate sector because of solidarity which has been built up through the improvement of conditions and wages for their members. So, although there are a number of issues which will be important at this federal election, I think what people need to understand is there is one central issue which goes back to the Howard government's work choice program, where we're seeing the current coalition led by Dutton, who are very keen to remove all these legislative frameworks which have been put in place to protect workers, especially the same work, same pay legislation, because this should be a major issue. But as far as the Murdoch press is concerned, and remember, all those of you who think the legacy media has no impact on federal politics, think again. Why do you think Mr. Murdoch is taking his kids to court in order to break a binding agreement in terms of the division of his estate amongst his 4 oldest children and giving power to one, Lachlan Murdoch? Obviously it's all about news. It's all about the extensive legacy empire as well as the new digital empire. Because the legacy media sets the agenda for debate. And if you look at the legacy media, it's all about criminalising people who come together to improve their situation in the workplace. It's about criminalising legitimate workplace activity, like withdrawing your labour outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period, like having a picket line to promote your particular issues. So industrial relations will be, should be at the centre, because whether you are in a union or not, the flow-on effect of legislation encompasses everyone. So you may be one of the 88% of workers who is no longer in a trade union, but the fact is that because of the legislative framework, you will be impacted by a change in legislation which removes protections which have come in over the past 2.5 years. Now obviously a federal election is an issue of choice, and the fact that we have a preferential system makes it a lot easier to vote for political parties or independents who are promoting ideas and issues and policies that you agree with. But ultimately, it's a Liberal-Labor competition. Although the Australian Greens have been giving the Labor Party a run for their money. But at the end of the day, it'll be the distribution of preferences which will decide what the next government is. And whether you're interested in electoral politics or not, whether you vote or not, the issue is the legislative agenda which is being pushed by a Dutton-led coalition, not just in terms of Palestine, not just in terms of human rights, not just in terms of creating a nuclear energy juggernaut in this country, not just in terms of giving more and more and more power to employers, but in terms of removing legislation which has been put in place to protect people from the excessive greed of the corporate sector. So it's laughable, totally laughable, for the corporate sector to say that the Hawke-Keating Accord with business has now been betrayed by the Albanese-led Labor government. The Albanese-led Labor government has tread lightly. It has made minor, not major, but minor legislative changes which are there to protect people from corporate excesses. And in a society where more and more and more people are employed by corporations, it is important that we have a mechanism via which to fight back. And if that mechanism, the traditional trade union structure, has been betrayed by successive governments, if legislation has been passed to make trade unions almost virtually powerless, then it's important that we don't allow a coalition's workplace policies to plunge us back into the dark ages, because it's not just about conditions, it's not just about wages. Ultimately, it's about security. Job security is essential. When they talk about increasing productivity for wage rises, what they're saying is we will remove conditions which have protected you, and if you're lucky, we'll throw a few crumbs off the corporate table in your direction. So the corporate Australia has a war chest. It's ready for a battle. It will be putting all its eggs in a Dutton-led coalition to become the next government of this country. Whether the next government of this country is a Labor Party-led government, or an Australian Greens Labor Party coalition, or an Australian Greens Labor Party independent coalition, will ultimately depend on electors. Now obviously, not every group will have policies which you agree with, but ultimately, if you do vote, you need to make a choice. Because ultimately, unless we put public interest before corporate interests, we will continue in this country to have all the major issues which we face today, where an increasing number of people are finding they are ostracised, marginalised, pushed aside, not because of identity, but because of the fact that access to this country's wealth is held by this corporate conglomerate, which will be using everything at their disposal with the support of the Murdoch media and to a lesser degree the government gilded ABC to ensure that a Dutton-led Liberal Party with workplace policies which will increase corporate profitability will be what we face after the federal election in 2025. So if you're interested in pursuing these issues, I encourage you to join Public Interest Before Corporate Interests. You can do it online. It's easy. Doesn't cost anything. It's important that we put the interests of the many before the interests of the few.